Thank you, everyone, for joining this kickoff call for the Penn Alumni Free Speech Alliance. For anyone who doesn't know me, which is probably most of you, my name is Alexander McCobin. I'm a 2008 graduate of the School of Arts and Sciences, very proud Penn alum, and I'm one of the leaders and founders of the Alumni Free Speech Alliance, not because I had a driving passion to start this group. I very actively kept trying to find someone else to start this in the fall, but because I believe this is something that is incredibly important, it's something that I'm passionate about, and because I care about the University of Pennsylvania as my alma mater and as an incredible institution in the United States and the world. It's something that I decided that I needed to start if no one else was going to get going. But before I get to that, let me provide some context for why I even care about this and my background for this conversation today. When I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, I already cared about principles like free speech. Actually, Greg Lukianoff from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education and I met while I was a student at Penn, and I believe invited him to speak on campus and then collaborated on a number of initiatives because while at Penn, I started a student organization called Students for Liberty that became a national and global group that very actively promoted free speech in the late 2000s and early 2010s. One of the most common events that we supported student groups organizing across the United States were called free speech walls, where we would have students would take a giant piece of white paper, put it somewhere on public display at their university, and let people write anything they wanted to on these walls. And of course, some people wrote offensive things on there, things that enraged or upset other people. I distinctly remember an incident where someone wrote, F you, President Obama, and a professor at the school got so angry, he took box cutters to that and ripped it down. And whenever that would happen, which wasn't an infrequent occurrence, what I loved was that political groups across the ideological spectrum often came together to rebuild or defend the free speech walls in the early 2010s. You would have the college libertarians, the college socialists, the Republicans and Democrats literally all stand together to rebuild these walls and come out and publicly support them, saying that free speech is a nonpartisan, non-ideological issue. It's something that everyone should defend and support. And so watching what seems to be the backsliding of not only higher education, but society broadly on this important principle is something that's concerned me for a while. But then I think, like many of you, it became especially concerning to me this past fall at the University of Pennsylvania, watching what happened not only in the wake of the October 7th attacks, but in the congressional testimony from former President Liz McGill and the conversations that I started to hear on campus about what should be done in response to all of this and believing that we need to have a robust conversation and provide a space for alumni to advocate for support for principles of free speech back at Penn. Because as alumni, Penn is a part of our identity. It's never going to leave us. And it's something that we as stakeholders, as people who dedicated a significant part of our lives to the university, as people who advocate for it to the rest of the world and represent it, ought to pay attention to and provide feedback and support to those still on campus for. That's why I'm thrilled to see not only alumni on this call, but professors, students, even Penn leadership, some members of the Board of Trustees here, to be a part of this conversation and to talk about the state free special promotion today, as well as to talk about what Penn alumni can do to foster a discussion around this and advocate for free speech. Now, I mentioned before that I didn't plan to start this. We only got going really at the end of December when I realized no one else was taking
New Jersey.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to remind everyone, please mute yourself if you can, so that we're able to keep going. But as we were getting started, I have to say I have tremendous gratitude to Marina Glasman here, the other Penn alum who's really been driving getting this going. But up to this point, it's really just been us. We have support from the National Alumni Free Speech Alliance to give us some direction and support. But after this kickoff call, we're going to be looking for help from other alumni. We want your ideas for what we should be doing. We want your help in providing support for putting on more events, for initiatives to advance free speech, to engage in conversations with students, faculty, and leadership so that we're able to press these ideas forward. So I want everyone here to know the point of this call is not only to raise awareness and have this conversation, it really is to be a kickoff for us to work together going forward, and for this to be an invitation for all of you to help us build the Penn Alumni Free Speech Alliance and to make a difference back at Penn. Now, I'm going to end my remarks there and just lay out how the rest of this call is going to go. I'm going to give both Greg and Jesus, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, about 10 minutes each to give some presentations on the state of free speech in academia and society today, and to talk about the experience as a professor at Penn and one of the authors of the great document Penn Forward. And then I've got a number of questions that I want to share that I've heard from a lot of alumni as we've been putting this together, but then open it up to everyone else here. So if at any point you have a question that you want to ask, feel free to type it into the chat box so that we can try to get to it. We'll get to as many as we can right now. And if we can't get to everything during this hour, want to try to provide a way to answer your questions, perhaps connect you with Jesus or Greg, or we at Penn AFSA will work on answering them for you, because this is the start of a long journey ahead for us to bring about change. And it starts with us having a conversation, answering as many questions as possible, even having a robust debate about these ideas as we can. So with that, I'm going to go ahead, and really it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Greg Lukianoff, the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Now, Greg's background is perfect for leading this organization and for being our first speaker here. He's not only an attorney and a New York Times bestselling author, he's produced documentaries and award-winning films about free speech, and in my opinion, is one of the greatest advocates we have for these foundational principles in society today. And Greg, especially since we've known each other for so long, I know that your time is very limited, you're very busy. I just can't thank you enough for being willing to help us kick off the Penn Alumni Free Speech Alliance and share your insights and wisdom with us today.
And thank you so much, and so good to see you. FIRE, as I think a lot of you know, but maybe not all of you do, is a Philly-based organization. We actually, our headquarters looks right out over Independence Hall, and Philly's been very good to us in terms of talent. You know, we were founded by Alan Charles Kors, a professor emeritus who, you know, hopefully many of you got to enjoy as a professor at Penn, and Harvey Silverglate was the other co-founder, who's up in Cambridge, a civil liberties attorney. So I'm going to give a brief presentation on some of the stats that I have on Penn and some of the cases that explain kind of the national situation. I'm going to try to go through them fairly quickly so we can, you know, get to questions, which is always the most fun. So let me see. There we go. Share. There. Okay. The state of free speech at Penn, very creatively named. Okay, so FIRE has been asked to do a a ranking for freedom of speech since we were first established. But as hopefully anybody who's read my books know, I take my data very seriously. So you know, we're 25 years old this year. But it was only relatively recently that I felt like we had the kind of high-powered data to really actually say pretty definitively what schools are great for free speech. And we ended up with number one being Michigan Technological University, Auburn University, University of New Hampshire. University of Virginia was one of the better-known schools in the top 10. University of Chicago was 13th. And then there was the schools that didn't do so hot. The worst of all, as you may have heard a little bit this fall, was Harvard. And Harvard had initially was like, well, the methodology must be flawed. And that was great because it gave me the opportunity to explain. No, it's actually based on the largest study of student opinion ever conducted, the largest database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, speech codes, and deplatforming ever put together. And by the way, you got a negative score. You got a negative 10.69, the first negative score anyone's ever gotten in our history. So we rounded it up to a 0, but not too far behind. Harvard, unfortunately, was, as many of you know, and probably some of you don't, Penn. Penn did not do so hot. But then it's University of South Carolina, Georgetown University also did really badly, and so did Fordham. So Penn's not doing so hot, and it doesn't look like it's likely to do all that much better next year, given the factors that we consider in the ranking, including professor cancellations, deplatforming, etc. So there is some, there's a little bit of good news, is that some of the percentage of Penn students saying that what topic is difficult to discuss, some of it's actually improved since 2022. Some of it's even improved since 2021. 2021 was not exactly a great year for free speech on campus. Actually, the two worst years I've seen in my career in terms of professor cancellations were actually 2020 and 2021. And 2022, not so hot either. But I have a feeling when the polling comes in for this past year, people are going to say a lot more was a lot harder to talk about in 2023. Not great. The percentage of Penn students saying that it's at least rarely acceptable to engage in violence, blocking entry, shout down, that's gone up, and that's going up nationally as well. Interestingly, only about half of Oberlin students were willing to say that violence in response to speech is never okay, which is kind of remarkable. Otherwise, it was overwhelmingly former women's colleges that had really high rates of people saying violence is okay sometimes in response to freedom of speech, which of course is not exactly great. So Harvard's abysmal, and that is what they scored. Performance in this year's CFSR did Penn a major favor, but Penn's ranking will likely drop in 2025 because of a number of cases, including this case of a left-wing Jewish group not being able to screen Israelism, and that's definitely something that you're going to be docked some points on that. And also the continuing prosecution of Amy Wax is something that we have real concerns about. We found it really took some, forgive the expression, stones to, after going in front of Congress and explaining how great Penn was for free speech, to continue proceeding after Amy Wax. I think 1 or 2 weeks later was pretty impressive. And Penn, it is the case that the Ivy League all did really quite poorly in the campus free speech ranking. Elite colleges in general, with the exception of, again, University of Chicago and University of Virginia, did quite poorly. And this picture for for free speech in American higher ed writ large is not great. So I take the example of DEI statements as being one of the most galling examples of universities just being incredibly out of touch. I wrote something at Reason Magazine that was based on a chapter from Canceling of the American Mind, my book that came out in October, explaining how at a time of unprecedented professors losing their jobs, it was amazing to see that universities in 2020 and 2021 decided to add a political litmus test to the process of hiring, and in many cases to admissions. Even some conferences now require DEI statements to attend. And I think it's remarkable that only half of the people we surveyed among professors nationally believe that they were political litmus tests that violate academic freedom. I think the other half should be embarrassed, because obviously, if you ask people about their commitment to DEI, there's no way you cannot evaluate their politics. So 90% of conservatives are like, yeah, well, of course it's political litmus test, and about 56% of moderates do. And now, depending on if the 2021 survey, which showed that about 3/4 of schools were thinking about adopting them, we're probably living in a world in which most schools have these political litmus tests. A snapshot of viewpoint diversity in elite higher ed. This is one of the stats that we have in Counseling of the American Mind. This is a snapshot of most departments at Harvard, but not all. And we found a ratio of about 88-1 in terms of conservative to liberal. This is something that I did not take quite as seriously at the beginning of my career 23 years ago. But if you're going to try to actually engage in knowledge production, you better have some political diversity among your professors, because groupthink is the enemy of the production of at least accurate knowledge or anything worth the name. And it's been really bad for professor cancellations. When we look at the number of professor targeting, we're talking about, over 1,000 examples from the beginning of what we dubbed cancel cultures beginning in 2014, to today, over the last 9.5 years, because all the data from the book, we concluded that in July. We're talking about over 1,000 attempts to get professors punished or fired in some way. About 2/3 of those successful in some way. That includes things like getting your article pulled, or being suspended. And almost 200 of them involve professors actually losing their jobs. About 40 of those are tenured professors. And, I tried to give some perspective on this. The last time, so in the last 50 years, since the law has been established protecting freedom of speech on campus, at least at public colleges, the biggest sort of national security threat that was used to justify mass firings of professors or mass punishment of professors was 9/11, and that was 9/11 in the Iraq War. About 15 professors were targeted in the years after 9/11, and about 3 of them were fired, all of whom were actually fired for things, including one big case that we handled very early on, actual ties to international terrorism. So all 3 of those professors who were fired for reasons that actually didn't seriously implicate academic freedom and free speech, whereas all of the professors we're talking about here have been. And there's no meaningful comparison in the last 50 years. So it's one of the reasons why we wrote Canceling the American Mind, to make the argument. Not only is this happening, it's happening at a scale that we have no meaningful comparison to. I mean, even when you look at the Red Scare, you're talking about the normal number cited is about 100 professors lost their jobs, about 62 for being communists. And we're talking about a number that's several times larger than that. 1 in 6 professors report having been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their free speech. That's one of the reasons why we know that the number that we're talking about of 1,000 is far larger. That's tens of thousands of professors if extrapolated to larger society. When we ask students the same question, have you been actually disciplined or threatened with discipline for your speech? About 1 in 10, and that would extrapolate it outward be well over 1 million students. Again, no meaningful comparison that we're familiar with in American history. When it comes to political discrimination, I was really impressed by the data showing that professors are willing to admit that they would discriminate on the basis of conservative views. That means the number who actually would is decidedly larger. Being, having enough self-knowledge to admit that you would is not great. And we cover all of this in Canceling of the American Mind, my latest book. We really do try to bring it all together and then layer the conformity-inducing pressures on top of each other. The book is likely to lead you potentially quite pessimistic about the state of higher education, but I hope that you turn some of that pessimism into actual action, because I think now is a moment when there's at least some momentum for full change, but it's now or never. And this is my contact information. And someone's talking. So thanks for having me.
Greg, I know you went through that very quickly. We've got a lot to ask you about to dig in here, but again, thank you so much. And before I introduce our professor next, I do want to I'll say this. Even in just putting the Alumni Free Speech Alliance together, I have been shocked by how many faculty and students have told me that they're interested in this and want to get involved, but have asked to remain anonymous because they're scared of repercussions, even for speaking out for or writing an op-ed or supporting free speech as something to care about. And no one really, I think, is better to talk about this than Professor Jesús Fernández-Villaverde, who is the Howard Marks Presidential Professor of Economics at Penn. He's been a faculty member for over 20 years at the university, and he's the co-author of, as I said, this great document, Penn Forward, a new constitution for Penn. Professor, sorry, I know you don't want me to say that. Jesús, thank you for coming and sharing your actual experience on campus and telling us more about what's going on from your perspective, what Penn Forward is all about, and providing us some guidance as alumni for how to move forward.
Okay. So first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, yes, I have been a professor at Penn since 2001. So by now, I think I probably love the institution as much as you do, and it's my desire to make the best possible effort to improve Penn. And I want to point out that if any of you is in campus or want to reach out to me, I'm always glad to talk with people. And the good thing about having that super strange last name is that if you put it on Google, I promise I'm the first hit. So you are not going to have any concern about it. So let me tell you how I got interested into free speech at Penn. Since I arrived at Penn, I have been teaching basically the same course for undergrads with different names. It's a course that goes over economic history and tries to think about the reasons why some nations have grown and some nations have not grown so much. So we discuss issues like tariffs. Are tariffs a good idea or are tariffs not a good idea? Infant industries. Should we protect infant industries? Taxes. How high should taxes be? I will say that none of these topics is too polemical. They are very interesting topics to discuss, but none of them is a red hot bottom issue that will put you on the front page of the New York Times. So around 2008, 2009, I will say, who is in favor of the infant industry protection? And I will get 10 undergrads raising their hands and having very lively and I think very educational conversations in the classroom. Around 2014, 2015, I started noticing that fewer and fewer hands were being raised. At the beginning, I thought, well, maybe it's the new generation. Maybe they like to talk a little bit less in class. But, some of the students will come to my office hours and will engage with me into those conversations. So finally, after this happened maybe 4 or 5 times, I asked, you made a very good argument, very coherent, very well structured. Why didn't you say that in class when I asked? And to my immense surprise, I started hearing the same answer. I don't want to say my political opinions in class. In fact, one student around 2018, before answering the question, tells me, do you mind if I close the door? And at once I was like, what? No, you don't want undergrad with a meeting with undergrads with the door closed, just in case. I say, okay, fine. He closed the doors and he tells me, well, the problem is I'm very much in favor of free markets and I'm really afraid that my classmates will make my life difficult if I say that. And I thought, this is not good. It's not good to have to be in a situation where students at Penn cannot really say what they think in a civil way, of course, with good arguments in an engaging way. I don't think it's good either for the students who cannot express their opinion, but it's not good either for students who disagree with those opinions because they don't hear the other side of the argument either. So I started talking with people. I started, a little bit of a small group in my department, which later became a small center that I currently run. Part of the idea was to be able to offer undergraduate courses, to offer events or organize events where, things could be discussed in an open way. And, this is economic policy. We are not talking here about anything too radical or too polemical. And I think that over the years, we were able to grow a little bit into a space where people could talk. Where things got a little bit more complex, and that's when I decided to co-write Penn Forward with Jules, who is a professor at Wharton and who thinks is also today in the meeting, was because we started noticing that things were not going very well at the higher level, at the level of the administration. That the university was starting to take very open political positions on issues where I don't think the university needs to take a particular position. I think the universities can take a much more of a Chicago-style institutional neutrality approach. I started feeling that I was the director of graduate studies at that moment at the Department of Economics. I started to receive a lot of pressures from the administration not to select graduate students for the PhD program based on merit and academic excellence, but based on other criteria. I started noticing that even saying things like merit and academic excellence was frowned upon in some meetings. I had a couple of unpleasant discussions, and I thought that something different had to be done. And during the big problem that we had during the fall and all the complications, Jules and I thought maybe this is a moment to write a document where we can outline a little bit what we think it will be a good future for the University of Pennsylvania. And it's not a strange future. It's in some sense coming back to the Penn that I love from 2010. So if I have a magic wand and we could go back to 2010, I will use that magic wand right now. So it's not that I'm asking from some utopia that never existed. Maybe Greg thinks that 2010 was not good enough, but certainly in comparison with the situation of 2021 and 2022, certainly was good enough. And we tried to write a document that was as much as Big Tent as possible. We really try our very best to say, look, this is something that we believe that 90% of alumni, 90% of faculty, perhaps 70% of graduate students, and 95% of undergrads will agree. A university that values institutional neutrality, but at the same time foster an environment where all ideas can be discussed in an open and civil way. A university who really cares a lot about academic excellence. A university that is focused on becoming what Benjamin Franklin always thought the future of Penn should be, the best university in the world. And what I think everyone should be aware is we have a window of opportunity right now. If we are able to change Penn in the best direction and some of the other Ivy Leagues don't, we have a strategic opportunity to top the market. I know many of you work in the business world, so you may find this as an appealing argument. If we become, quote unquote, the good Ivy, the healthy Ivy, where ideas can be discussed, we can really become the top #1 university in the world. And all of us couldn't be happier, I think, if we achieve that. Thank you.
Jesus, Greg, again, thank you. And, I have a few questions I want to ask, but I think David Nevins asked a great question in the chat that'll level set everything else here, which really is, okay, when we say that we're advocating for free speech or there's a threat to free speech, what does free speech really mean? And Jesus, you started to really get at that at the end there, I think, but let's start the conversation about that there before we go into any other questions, or I'll let you two clarify what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, freedom of speech, we tend to explain it in terms of like, I tend to argue for free speech culture in addition to First Amendment protections, but at the same time argue that I think the First Amendment gets a lot of things right, and in terms of what speech is protected and what speech isn't and shouldn't be protected. So generally, when people ask me about free speech on campus, they're asking about things like true threats, actually placing someone in fear of bodily harm or death. Not protected, nor should it be. It's not protected anywhere, not in the U.S., and it should be prosecuted if you're doing that. There's discriminatory harassment, which is a pattern of discriminatory behavior that is severe, persistent, and pervasive, directed at an individual or group based on their perceived group membership. And that's something that applies on campuses and in businesses, for example, to prevent active and aggressive discrimination against individuals. Now, we've definitely seen, in some cases, discriminatory harassment being used just to go after viewpoints by themselves, and that's not okay. If you use it just to go after individual viewpoints, at like a one-time someone saying something, having an offensive point of view, that's not okay under the First Amendment, nor should it be. But it does recognize that you can have a discriminatory pattern of behavior to try to make someone's life miserable so that they drop out of a school because you don't like the color of their skin or the religion that they are. So I think that when it comes to what free speech is, I think the purest form of free speech is the freedom to express your opinion, to actually say what you really think, and to play. And actually, no, even more important even in higher ed, to play with ideas, to engage in devil's advocacy, to engage in thought experimentation. And given that Penn and other institutions like it are supposed to exist, at least in part, for the production of knowledge, you need all of those things, or else you're just recapitulating dogma.
So let me take so first of all, I'm an economist. I'm not a constitutional law professor. So you will forgive me if I'm not 100% precise. But a few months ago, I read a very nice paper by Cass Sunstein, Free Speech on Campus, 37 questions. And it's not that I agree with 100% of what he says, but I thought that the way in which he framed the 37 questions and his answers was most reasonable. I think this is really something where 95, 98% of people will agree on. And for instance, no discrimination on viewpoints, no discrimination of saying things that it's okay. So if you go and write an article, okay, this was something that happened. This is a real case. Two persons, one of which is a friend of mine, wrote an article in the newspaper saying that they were against diversity statements. And one of them was going to go to MIT to give a talk, and he was canceled. Well, that's certainly not free speech. You can perfectly say that you don't agree with diversity statements, and nothing should happen to you if you do something like that. And moreover, I think there is also, I fully agree with Greg's point about culture of free speech. You cannot be in a situation where you go to talk to the administration and you say, hey, 50% of students feel they don't want to talk about issues. And the administration says, oh, but it's not our fault because it's not that we prevented anyone. No, maybe it's something that you did or that you helped to create when 50% of the students feel they don't want to talk about these issues. The university gets out of its way all the time to promote certain ideas. And I very rarely see Penn getting out of their way or its way to emphasize to undergrads that free speech, is a core principle of inquiry within any research university.
Thank you. Now I have two questions before I go to others who are raising their hands, which I appreciate for an orderly process, and questions in the chat. But first off, I want to share that in talking with a number of Penn alumni about putting this group together, I've heard from some of them say that after Liz McGill's testimony to Congress, they have come to think that free speech is the problem on Penn's campus, that it is the cause of anti-Semitism after October 7th, and that more restrictions is actually a solution rather than more free speech. And I'm wondering what you two would say to that.
I've definitely written my opinion on this, and I think it's based on bad history, bad philosophy, and the bad history is, what do you think the situation was on campus prior to October 7th? Do you think administrators weren't enforcing speech codes or weren't enforcing punishments according to speech that they thought they didn't like? And the answer is, of course they were. This was happening all over the country. So the idea that there was too much free speech, particularly at elite colleges, particularly at Penn, is nonsense. So it's based on bad history first. It's based on bad philosophy because essentially everything that people have brought up in terms of speech that they think goes too far, with some exceptions, are threats, are discriminatory harassment, are things that actually that schools are within their right to punish. However, if you're saying someone saying that, the example that kept on coming up was someone saying intifada or from the river to the sea. Now, in First Amendment law, there is absolutely no question that's protected. Now, of course, when I hear that, I'm not Jewish myself, but I'm with the Jewish students who hear that kind of sounds like you're saying, particularly from the river to the sea, that you want to wipe us out. Now, meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal actually looked into this, and they started quizzing students who were doing this at Columbia and showing them maps and being like, here's the river, here's the sea. Get the problem? There's nothing in between there. And student after student actually said, oh, I'm less pro that now. So, and that's a way of illustrating that, yeah, you actually even do have a free speech right to say, I think this country should no longer exist. And you do have that free speech right. But it's particularly important to understand that a lot of times that's not even what students think they're saying. Now, is that a massive educational failure on the part of a lot of these schools? I think it absolutely is, and it's profoundly embarrassing, but it does matter what they actually think they're saying. So the idea that there's been too much free speech on campus, it doesn't stand up to history, And the thing you got to remember, particularly, and this is the thing that drives me nuts in particular, donors and alumni from off campus think that if they pass a rule that in order to prevent speech that the donors and alumni don't like, that that's going to be enforced in a way that they want it to be enforced. And it's like, no, it's going to be enforced by the same administrators and the same ideologues who created this toxic environment in the first place. They're going to use it, no matter how well-intentioned your idea of the speech suppression, they're going to use it against the opinions you like. And so like when even people talk about the going like, well, we just want to ban genocidal speech. I'm like, and you know what happened within like 3 minutes of October 7th? People started saying, well, the Israelis are engaged in genocide in Gaza, so we have to ban, all speakers who are Israeli. That's an argument they're making nonstop now, which was completely predictable. So the idea that there's too much free speech on campus or that you can fix this problem on campus by having less, I think is foolishness.
Yeah. So my view of the world has always been that no institution that has been created to fix a problem has ever fixed that problem, at least within universities. In the sense that if you create an office to defend free speech in campus, they are going to be very creative at keeping free speech problems within campus. More pointedly, I think that a lot of what we saw in October comes precisely from the fact that we have not had robust conversations about foreign policy in the US, about the history of the Middle East, etc. And that's why a lot of students have been educated on a very particular view of the world without having been exposed to both sides. And I think that, for instance, the graph that Greg showed up of 88 to 1 at Harvard was very, very striking to me. And in that sense, I'm very, very worried that any introduction of further protections in campus is only going to create more bureaucracy and is only going to create more trouble, and we are going to end up worse. And on the other hand, it's much easier to just let people talk and, just come forward and say, look, I value that people say what they want to say. And when someone says something that maybe crosses the line a little bit, you just don't do anything. You know, as my undergrads will say, chill out, man.
Yeah. Oh, and I did want to add one other piece of data that we had from the research department at FIRE. We found a strong correlation between schools that rated very poorly in terms of whether or not you could discuss ideas with your friends or with your professors, and anti-Semitism. that essentially having a highly repressive or repressed environment tended to actually be a sign that you would have more anti-Semitism, which makes sense because basically in a situation in which everybody is afraid to speak, you can create a situation in which people very much divide each other into just simple heroes versus villains. And under that dynamic, it is unsurprising that people fall pretty quickly into the worst aspects of intersectionality and anti-racism.
Now, everything you two have said sounds pretty bleak, and especially for alumni who aren't on campus, who feel really removed from the university. The question is, can we even make any change? Is there any hope for this? And I would love for you two to share, is there hope? And is there hope for alumni to help make a difference about this?
Well, let me go first. I think the answer is yes. Of course, there is hope. And the hope needs to come from the alumni. I mentioned this to Alexander once. In some sense, you are the real owners of the university. As Alexander mentioned, you are Penn alumni until the day you die. One day, I may take another job and I may not be a Penn professor anymore. But you will always, always, always be Penn alumni. And you need to let the leadership at the university and the administrators know that you are not happy with the situation and that change needs to happen. And it matters, first of all, because you love Penn, but second, be selfish for a second. Okay, what do I mean be selfish for a second? You want the Penn degree to be still a valuable degree in 2050. You want your Penn degree to be well recognized in 2060. And if the university is not a university where there is vigorous discussion of topics, it means that the new students will not be as good. And that will lead to worse outcomes, and your Penn degree will value less, both emotionally and in monetary terms. So what can you do? I think that what you need to do is tell whoever is going to select the new president, whoever is going to select the new provost, whoever is going to select the new dean of art and sciences, things can be done in a different way. And the new leadership, the new generation of leaders that should take Penn to 2030, 2040, need to address issues from a different perspective. And it's really through changes in the leadership and going top down that effective change will happen. So in some sense, it's really you, it's not me. Sorry to say it in that way.
Yeah, I definitely think that there is good cause for pessimism overall. But I think the way you overcome that, is by trying, to keep the economic sort of comparison going, is to have a diversified portfolio. And I do think that people should spend time and money trying to see if they can save some of these elite institutions, including Penn, because they're elite and they're probably going to be here in 50 to 100 years. So the idea that they're just going to cease to exist is unrealistic. So you should try to save them, but that shouldn't be all you're doing, and that shouldn't be where people are putting all their money. Like the idea that someone's just going to continue to give hundreds of millions of dollars to Harvard, for example, in hopes that it will fix itself is just asinine, in my opinion. It's good money after bad, or bad money after bad. So I do think that investing, of course, I think investing in organizations like FIRE, which defends free speech both on and off campus, is part of it. But I also think that investing in experiments is part of it. I think University of Austin is a good experiment. My only issue with the University of Austin is we need 1,000 of them. I think we need little tiny groups where basically their entire jobs are to try to replicate the scholarship coming out of higher education as it exists today, pointing out like how shoddy it can often be to actually, I think we need smaller experiments all over the country that are trying to actually do what higher education can do today for lower costs and higher rigor, that can be better signals to employers that this is actually the best and brightest people out there. And I think even if all you care about is Penn, and it shouldn't be, to be clear, but even if all you care about is Penn, you should still support these. Why? Because outside pressure, as soon as some of the big guys in Silicon Valley start saying, you know what, this little tiny startup is actually producing people who are better thinkers and more reliable hires than the elite colleges produce, that's going to create the kind of competitive pressure that makes it realize that this is life or death, that essentially like this school actually has to reform. So yes, by all means, try to reform Penn, but try to make it part of a larger strategy that could actually work.
Thank you both. And Professor Wax, I noticed your hand was the first one up earlier on. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to unmute yourself, I'd love to invite you to comment or ask a question.
Yes, thank you. I was going to address what the principles of free expression on campus should be. That's a very big topic, but I'm going to do it by way of commenting on anti-Semitism and this desire to banish anti-Semitism. I am 100% Jewish, I am 100% pro-Israeli, but I am very wary of the campaign to banish anti-Semitism. Why? Because it is based on principles that I think are very dangerous and frankly contrary to the First Amendment as the Supreme Court has very ably articulated it. And what are those? The desire not to feel unsafe, the desire not to be upset, the desire not to be offended. And here I am not talking about direct physical threats because the Supreme Court has recognized that those violate the First Amendment. I am talking about speech that people consider disquieting and upsetting and offended. When I was growing up, my parents would always ask, is it good for the Jews? Now that I'm a grown-up, I ask, is it good for conservatives? Enshrining this desire to save people from offense and upset is not good for conservatives. It is being used against me to persecute and punish me. And Penn is still pursuing the case against me, which violates and is contrary to every defensible principle of free expression, academic free expression, and First Amendment principles on campus. And all you have to do is look at the complaint against me and the hearing board decision against me to see that, okay? that was not supposed to be leaked until my case was final, but someone leaked it. And it's a shambles. It's a total disgrace. So be very, very careful. The heckler's veto is alive and well at Penn and on every other campus. The second reason that I think that we should tolerate what is considered by many to be anti-Semitic speech or anti-Israel, anti-Jewish speech is that don't we want to know what these people really think?
Yes.
Don't we want to know? I mean, let's reveal what the pro-Hamas people really want. They are a death cult that is fundamentally antithetical to our American way of life. That is my opinion of it. And I wouldn't be able to show that and know that without hearing what they have to say. So let's hear what they have to say.
Yeah, and Professor Wax just said that is absolutely the fundamental part of my idiosyncratic belief in freedom of speech, which I just call the pure informational theory of freedom of speech. And basically, like, it's always valuable to know what people really think, full stop, period. And that essentially, if the project of human knowledge is to understand the world as it is, you cannot know that without knowing what people really think. And every time that you cause people to lie about what they really think, you're actually doing the rest of the world a disservice by doing that. And meanwhile, think about what happened. What would have happened if somehow campuses were so powerful that they could have shut down some of the crazier, the pro-Hamas, or for that matter, pro-Houthi, which that was impressive, protests that we saw over the past couple of months. We would have gotten a sense that, oh, maybe things aren't that bad. If they were to do it like silently and completely just shut people up without anybody really noticing that this was happening, you would have gotten the sense that, well, I guess things aren't that bad on campus. Meanwhile, by actually getting to see the ideology on campus, people are like, something's not right here. And I will say one thing about post October 7th, and I said this on the Bill Maher show. Actually, sorry, Bill Maher said this when I was on the Bill Maher show back in December, is that one good thing that did come out of October 7th is that when I wrote Canceling the American Mind through most of last year and the year before, I got depressed writing it, because even though I've been doing this for 23 years, I was like, it's even worse than I thought. But then after, and when it came out, I'm like, and they'll just dismiss me, and nothing will actually change on campus. After October 7th, I'm running into, and this is what Bill said as well, only the craziest people are saying there's nothing wrong on campus anymore. So knowing what people really think has led to a lot of people going, what are we doing here? This needs to be fixed.
Yeah, can I just add one more thing? A number of people have asked, what can we do? How can we help? Nobody has come to my assistance. Tell the administration to drop the case against me. My dean has the full power to drop the case against me, which should never have been brought, right? Because I dared to challenge the received wisdom openly about DIE and wokeness on campus. And I have students contacting me regularly saying, I need to talk to you. You are the only person that I can talk to. I am a valuable commodity on campus. They should be grateful that I'm there. And we have the very opposite reaction.
So on Tuesday, I was teaching. It was the first day of a course I'm teaching now. And I mentioned that the goal of the course was to get all the students to be able to pass what I call the ideological Turing test. So I don't know if you know this Turing test. It's this idea that you are a computer and you are trying to fool a human into believing you're a human. So the idea of the ideological Turing test is, if you are a liberal, can you fool me into thinking you're a conservative? And if you're a conservative, can you fool me into thinking you are a liberal? Because if you are able to pass the Turing ideological test, it means you have engaged with the sides, with both sides of the debate. And I was going to tell them, this is a class on markets and its critics. And I say, I'm going to do my very best of giving you both sides of the debate so you can pass the ideological Turing test. And that to me is absolutely fundamental. And that goes a little bit to what Amy was saying about, can you pretend for 30 seconds you are a Hamas supporter, or can you pretend for 30 seconds you are a super radical, pro these guys who like to settle expand the settlements? Can you pretend for 30 seconds to be someone you are not? And something I have noticed long time, for many times, is that when some people say, oh, I don't agree with you, and I say, that's fine. Can you say for 30 seconds what my position is? And they cannot explain for 30 seconds what my position is.
So we only have a few minutes left. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible, so we're going to have for answers to be a little briefer going forward. But Robert Chavez, did I pronounce that correctly?
Very close. Thank you, Alex. It's shocking to me, but in 2 months, it'll have been 50 years since I graduated from Penn. And just a quick anecdote. Back when Sheldon Hackney was president, there was an event that some of you may remember where the entire press run of the Daily Pennsylvanian was stolen, 20,000 copies, and dumped. And it was political. There was an article in it that a certain group didn't like. And I was shocked. And I was giving my little $100 a year to Penn at that time. And I wrote a letter to Hackney, and shockingly, he answered. And the letter was completely full of what he just hemmed and hawed and just wouldn't say that there was anything wrong with what had happened. So I offer this just to say, this has been brewing long before 2014. This has been going on for decades. And then it's finally just erupted in the last 7 or 8 years or so. My question, though, is I sometimes get worried that the free speech discussion itself seems a little bit academic. The reason people try to repress speech is because they have a political goal. And what we're really dealing with here is raw politics. And one of the first thing any regime does is, send the army to take over the TV station. And so this is not unlike that when you have people more and more saying, it's not that I don't like what you say, you're in the way of what I want to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not sure there's in terms of what we focus on or how we understand the problem or what we do, shouldn't we be thinking that it's a little bit more, it's nastier than just simply people not wanting to hear your opinion?
Oh, and doubtless. I mean, I think one of the funny things about the critical race theory movement is how straightforward it's been about power being the central thing to all of reality, and then we're shocked that they act exactly like they actually mean that, and end up being actually some of the only people who actually mean that. It's one of the reasons why you can't trust people who believe that ideology to a degree. But what you're saying is an argument for a lot of these little experiments, where essentially, like, part of the goal would be to have institutions that actually have checks and balances that prevent this from happening in the first place, that actually are committed to having political diversity. Like, Fire tries to make sure we have political diversity among our staff. It would, if that's, and I think you're right on a lot of this stuff, but it does point out how hard this will actually be to fix at Penn.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. And sometimes when people ask me this question, I give them some readings from Michel Foucault and Antonio Gramsci.
Yes.
By the way, no, this is they didn't invent anything. Foucault and Gramsci were the very first who very openly said you are going to use power to repress free speech, because free speech is just the ways in which, in their view of the world, the repressive bourgeois society tries to maintain power. So no, they are absolutely open about it. Take them for a beer one day.
Marcuse's repressive tolerance was very much kind of like, we're the good guys, everyone else is the bad guys, repress the bad guys, the so-called right-wingers.
Exactly. So it's not that they're even trying. You are 100% right. The only thing I agree with Greg that is they are not even trying to hide this. you only need to pick up the book.
Okay, one final thought though.
Sorry, Robert. I want to make sure that we give a student who's here actually the opportunity
Absolutely.
to share and ask a question since we have limited time. Mia, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi guys. So my name is Mia. I'm an undergraduate at Penn. So first of all, thank you all so much for like caring about this cause and really wanting to devote your time and energy. As a student who has really seen what the effects of free speech and the discourse around it have been over the past couple months, something like this is so needed, and it's so awesome to see such a large group of people who really want to help rally around this cause and help the undergraduates and anybody involved in Penn. So my question is, as a student, and I know myself and a couple other people or students who are on this call who happen to be leaders and in charge of a lot of the political spaces on campus. How do we educate ourselves? How do we educate others? How do we promote better discourse around free speech, especially among students who might not really be interested? I think that's a huge population. Penn isn't as political as I think it once used to be, which is a huge problem that we're having. I think students just aren't as engaged in these topics anymore. How do we get them? How do we use networks like the Alumni Alliance, each other? We just want to educate and really help the current state.
I'm going to speak just because I have to go right at 5. And I just wanted to say, come to the FIRE Summer Conference because it's a great network of a bunch of free speech weirdos from all over the spectrum that assemble every year. This year, it's going to be Blocked and Reported is going to be recording live from the, they're going to be recording from the National Constitution Center, and we're going to have other speakers there as well. So come get plugged in to the network, and because we have lots of thoughts on how to fight for free speech on campus. And thank you so much for having me, everybody. And
so let me throw a wild idea. Organize a reading group on John Stuart Mill on liberty. Because if you can, if that's a book that everyone should read like once a year and twice on leap years, like this one, because chapter 2 in particular, chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill on liberty is, I think to this day, the most coherent and powerful defense of free speech and free speech in education. And we, again, as I was saying before, we are not really doing anything. I don't think I defend anything different. I think I'm building in what is the tradition of genuine, independent scholarship that has flourished in US universities and before that in Western universities for centuries. So we have a big tradition that we can rely on. And I think that that's being aware that that tradition exists and that this fight was fought in the past is very important.
All right, I want to respect everyone's time. Greg obviously had to leave. Jesus probably does too. And just say thank you to everyone for joining this kickoff call. Thank you in particular to Greg and Jesus for speaking, for not only alumni, but faculty and students joining this. We are just beginning and want to provide a voice for alumni and provide a support structure for faculty, for students, for administrators who actually support free speech at Penn and find a way to make a difference. To help us do that, I shared a link in the chat, and we're going to send a follow-up with this too. But it's a feedback form for you to share what you thought about this conversation, what you think we should do with the Alumni Free Speech Alliance going forward, and offer to volunteer if you want to get involved and help us do this. But once again, really, thank you everyone for coming out, for caring about this, and for the awesome conversation and kickoff to the Penn Alumni Free Speech Alliance.
And if you're ever in campus, drop by.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. We'll be in touch shortly.
Thank you.